Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cornell and Washington Brooks School of Public Policy webinar on the crisis in the Ukraine. I'm John Cawley, I'm the director of Cornell and Washington, and I'm pleased to introduce the panelists for today's discussion. Ron Christie is a former senior advisor to both the White House and Congress, and he is CEO of Christie Strategies. He is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is the author of 3 books. He teaches a course on strategic advocacy for Cornell and Washington. Thanks for being with us, Ron.
Nice to be with you.
Tatiana Padilla is a PhD candidate in policy analysis and management at Cornell and a resident tutor for Cornell and Washington. She previously worked at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and her doctoral research focuses on those topics. Thanks, Tatiana, for being part of the webinar.
Thank you for having me, John.
David Silby is the associate director of Cornell and Washington. He's the author of several books on military history, and he teaches a course on military history and defense policy for Cornell and Washington. Thanks for joining us, David.
Great to be here, John. Thank you.
And finally, Cynthia Watson is Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs of National Defense University. She's a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and is the author of 10 books on national security. She teaches a course on U.S.-Chinese relations for Cornell and Washington. Thanks for joining us, Cynthia.
Thank you for the opportunity, John.
So the format of today's webinar is as follows. We'll begin by asking each of our 4 panelists to speak about a certain aspect of the Ukraine crisis. We'll then open it up to questions. You can submit questions using the chat feature at the bottom of the webinar. None of the other attendees will see what you type, but I will see it and I'll direct your questions to the panelists. So Cynthia, would you mind getting us started and sort of providing the necessary context by interpreting what's happening in the Ukraine and its broader implications?
Yeah, let me start by saying, as a public servant, I have to give a disclaimer that everything I'm about to say is my personal analysis and should not be interpreted as U.S. government policy. Let me start by saying I think that all of us, let's go to the next slide, please, John. I think all of us are well aware that 8 days into what is now the ground war, there are certain things that perhaps we didn't expect and perhaps we did. One is that Russian forces are gradually proceeding north from the Black Sea. And as we know, they have surrounded Ukraine on 3 sides. We've known that for several weeks. And that those forces moving north seem to be moving, by all indications, relatively smoothly. What is not happening as smoothly is that forces moving in from the north, from the Belarusian side, are moving as easily. And I think probably many people on this call have heard about the 40-mile convoy that appears to have been slowed pretty dramatically. That is actually a characteristic of Russian military operations that gets underplayed in the West, and that is historically they have terrible troubles with logistics. Second thing, we see that particularly in the last 24 hours, I would argue, the Russian military is employing much more civilian-centric tactics, and this is part of why it is particularly worrisome in light of what we've seen the Russians do, whether it was in Chechnya back in the 1990s, whether it was in Aleppo, or whether it's been in other conflicts around the world, even against their own people. The Russian military tends to be pretty reckless, if not indiscriminate. Third thing, we've seen a Zelensky government, Ukrainian people who have mounted stiff resistance. We often hear people in the lead up to a conflict who assume that their countries will, in fact, put up stiff resistance, and then it's not unheard of that they, in fact, don't. This is something that has been noteworthy, and I think it's instilled a lot of pride around the world in seeing someone stand up to the Russians, but we have to recognize that 8 days in, we're beginning to see some shortages, which are going to affect those people. No matter how brave, no matter how much will they have, they're going to confront shortages simply by the geography. And then finally, President Biden has led a remarkably united global community, certainly not 100%, but one that has stopped short, even with the unity that we've seen with sanctions and with proclamations, it has still had to stop short of directly confronting the Russians because of the nuclear capability that they still retain. And that is something that we have largely not focused on during the period after the end of the Cold War. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the early 1990s, and this is one of the reasons that many people thought they never would. They did, and this may be part of the reason we're now seeing a conflict today that Russia felt they could move into Ukraine. The second slide, third slide. So what are the uncertainties? Because one of the things that I would ask everybody on the call to remember is that the challenges of conflict today in the 21st century are largely driven by uncertainties. And what I've tried to isolate are 5 things that I think we really need to be looking at into the future. One is, how long can the Zelensky government and the Ukrainian political will stand up against this Russian military? Even if Russia's military is having logistical problems, the reality is that Ukraine has simply far fewer forces. And there is something about numbers that the Russians have historically always, as do the Chinese, by the way, thrown at a problem. Second question that I think is at least as interesting, and that is about the political will of the Russian military. There are some hypotheses out there asking whether what we're in fact seeing is not a logistical problem with the Russian military in this allegedly stopped 40-mile convoy, but in fact questions about what is it that Russia's fighting for. We know that there's some indication on the streets of parts of Russian cities that people are protesting, although Putin's trying to shut that down. But the question about whose war this really is one that's relevant for any military. Third question I would ask is, what would it take to, in fact, dissuade Putin from this action? I am not certain I have heard any plausible hypothesis to answering that question or to even addressing the question. Fourth thing that we have heard a lot about in Western press, and President Macron made a point about this a couple of days ago, is this question of whether Putin has become more isolated, potentially more erratic. And what does that mean in terms of his behavior and what we should anticipate he would do if things continue to go far more slowly than he apparently thought that they would? And by all indications, he probably thought that he would have this cleaned up relatively easily. And then finally, my last question is this really an assault on Ukraine that would stop with him feeling satisfied that he'd achieved that objective? Or is this the long hypothesized idea that Russia simply is interested in conquering Europe, or at least threatening much wider swaths of Europe, as we have talked about over the past 75 years. We can look back, and David is a historian, but we can look back and recognize that some wars last a very, very long time, and sometimes peace, in the case of the end of the Cold War, lasts a shorter period of time. But when we as humans are in the middle of it, we may assume that there's a permanent status to either of those conditions, war or peace. That is not necessarily the case. Let me stop with that, and then I assume we're going to take questions after everybody's done the presentation. Is that correct, John?
Correct. Thanks very much.
Thank
That was a fantastic overview and introduction to what we're seeing. Ron, would you mind giving us a description of the options that are faced by the Biden administration and other countries to deal with the crisis?
Absolutely, John. Thank you very much. And Cynthia set the table so well for me to opine here. Let me take you behind those magical 18 acres known as the White House grounds. And when you come in the ground floor of the West Wing, the immediate door that you see on your immediate right-hand side is the Situation Room. And 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the sit room is staffed by military officers, it's staffed by people from the National Security Council who are looking at all the hotspots around the world. Well, the hotspot now that we're focusing on is Ukraine, but also looking at the Taiwan Strait. And they are constantly reviewing, consulting, and trying to figure out how best to give President Biden and his most senior advisors the options they need to proceed in any number of circumstances. And I think Cynthia's last slide was an excellent rendition of what I think they're doing in the sit room right now, right? So for us in the Bush administration, every morning at 6:30 in the morning, there was a meeting that was convened, and we took this from the Clinton administration, so I assume that President Biden is doing this as well, that at 6:30 every morning, you had a meeting between the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor. And they would sit on the phone for 30 minutes, and it was fascinating listening to them go around the world and talk about what options the president should be considering or could have to actually engage in if a flash spot erupts. So what do I think the options are for the Biden administration? He's in a really difficult situation, John, and everyone on the webinar here. On one hand, the United States, along with the Russian Federation, are nuclear powers. The last thing that you want to do is engage a fellow nuclear power if you don't know what the outcome of the other individual, in this case, President Putin, could or might be. My dear friend, John Huntsman, the former governor of Utah, the former ambassador to the Russian Federation, has told me in numerous conversations that you don't want to poke the bear. You want to be very careful about not provoking Russia for fear for not only what they might unleash, as Cynthia has indicated, coming from the north, from the Black Sea heading north, but what could that mean for the Baltic states? What could that mean for Finland? Look at the historical implications, and I'll leave that to David for being a military historian, but look at where Russia has had incursions in the past. So we can talk about sanctions, and we've seen sanctions, but we know that the Russian Federation receives a good deal of their money from oil and gas. One of the things that we haven't done to provoke the bear and to poke the bear is put a very significant set of sanctions on their oil and gas industry. And for those of you on the webinar, you might not realize that the United States, believe it or not, imports 600, 700,000 barrels of oil a day from the Russian Federation. You look at what Canada has done to put sanctions on that and halt that. You looked at, in which I was surprised about, the German Federation of halting the permit for the Nord 2 pipeline. But the United States is in a difficult crossroads of, do we really want to make it seem worse for Vladimir Putin that he might escalate? So do we, number two, have a military incursion? Something that we've seen where NATO and the Western Alliance led in Kosovo back in the 1990s. This is not an Article 5 situation, obviously, with Ukraine not being a NATO member, but I think this incursion by Russia was clear that they did not want Ukraine to become a NATO member because they didn't want the rest of the NATO Federation to come to their defense. Number three, what else can we do, right? I mean, you've seen the oligarchs' assets frozen. You've seen Switzerland, which was remarkable, moving in to impose sanctions as well. And the president said, well, let's see how this works in the next 30 days. I don't know if we have 30 days. My experience in the White House, my experience in being in the White House in wartime is that events can spiral far more quickly out of control than you think. 30 days might turn into 30 hours. And so before I toss it back to you, John, I would say this. The Biden administration is confronted with moving troops to Poland, moving troops to NATO alliance members in the hope that that will stop Putin and his expansion for reaching out beyond Ukraine. But I would say to you that my current colleagues in the Situation Room and in the National Security Council are really mulling over a very difficult series of options to the President of the United States of, if this tripwire is hit, then how can the United States and our Western allies respond? And happily, I can say I'm sleeping well at night, which is something I guarantee you that they're not doing as we confront this very, very serious and tenuous situation in Ukraine and beyond.
Great. Thanks, Ron. I appreciate that. Does sound like a very fine line that they have to walk. So David, what can you tell us about the historical context of this conflict? Does this crisis particularly remind you of certain previous wars and incursions?
Yeah, thanks, John. And thanks to Cynthia and Ron for leading us off so well. I was struck by a quote from a Ukrainian member of parliament when talking about how long the war had gone on. She actually responded that we've been at war with Russia for 80 years. And I think that's a really sort of evocative statement about the kind of history and intimacy that Russia and the Ukraine have. They've been neighbors, they've been enemies, they've been allies with each other for almost 800 years. And in the United States, that has barely a quarter of that in terms of real history, that gives you a sense of how much sort of deep history there is between these two countries. They've lived with each other their whole historical lives. I'm not going to go through that whole history, although as a historian, I think I'm required to at some point. But I do want to pick out a couple of things that really sort of may evoke for us some of the tensions going on between the two countries. And then I also sort of wanted to lay a little bit of the groundwork for the kind of military operations that we're seeing, because that sort of feeds into, I think, a lot of the larger things that we're going to see. I would highlight two main historical events in the last century that are really driving this conflict in both directions. The first is the Great Famine of the 1930s. The Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union at that point, not particularly willingly. Stalin, in an attempt to break the wealthy class of peasants, the kulaks, who controlled Ukrainian agriculture, deliberately starved millions of them to death in a Soviet-created famine. And that famine not only killed millions of Ukrainians, but has become a sort of founding memory of Ukrainian nationalism. This is what they refer to when they're talking about we've been at war with Russia for 80 years on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, the event that I want to point to in historical sense is the fall of the wall in 1989 to 1991 and the fracturing of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union went from being one of the world's great superpowers, dominating Eastern Europe, dominating Central Asia, to being still sizable, but a much smaller fraction of what it had been. And that was terribly traumatic for the Russians. Putin was a mid-level KGB officer at that time. He's talked about how much that affected him. And he really sees the world and his responsibility as a way of recovering Russian influence. If you look at the world from a Russian perspective, they see themselves surrounded by NATO. All of those light green countries are NATO countries, and Putin looks at this as being a Russia that is not only weakened, but a Russia that is now surrounded by its enemies who are coming closer. He wants to reestablish that influence and that power. And, I'll note for a second, this is not so different than what the United States did in the Western Hemisphere in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Monroe Doctrine is about as assertive a statement of influence as anything else. And so what Putin's been doing is fighting a series of wars and small conflicts to try and grow Russian influence against Georgia, against the Ukraine earlier on to take Crimea and other parts of it. And this is his attempt to really bring the great Russian empire, as I think he would refer to it, back under Russian control. Ukraine is the jewel in the crown of that empire. It is the largest of the old Soviet republics. It is the largest exporter of grain in the world. This is his culminating adventure to try and make Russia a true empire again. Now, the interesting thing, let me sort of, so I think that's the history that's underlying it. Let me sort of flip to some of the military stuff that we're seeing, because I think that's critical to understand. It's interesting. They did the same thing in Ukraine as they had tried to do in Afghanistan, or that they did in Afghanistan in 1979, which is basically capture the capital city before anyone knew that they were at war. They landed in 1979 in Afghanistan. They captured Kabul airport. They sent in a division of troops to capture the city and take over the government, to decapitate the country before it knew what was going on. And they tried this here. We saw that with landings at Kyiv airport very early on, and failed because the Ukrainians were ready for it, may have been warned about it ahead of time, but suffered fairly substantial casualties. The Russians suffered fairly substantial casualties as they were trying to do it. And now what they're trying to do is, I think Cynthia highlighted that, is the kind of warfare that they're used to fighting. What the US military calls large-scale combat operations, or LSCO. It's got high casualties in the fighting forces. Civilians are often very heavily impacted, especially when they're fighting in a city. It is, and this is what I want to highlight about this kind of warfare, it is very heavily dependent on being able to supply your troops. I did a rough calculation. The Russian forces now in Ukraine are probably using around 2.5 million gallons of gas a day. Wow. 2.5 million gallons a day to keep that force moving. And then just to feed the soldiers, about 450 million calories a day. You've got to supply that to your troops. And that means you need railroads and you need roads. And if there's one thing I would highlight about what's been going on, it's the way that the Russians are trying to get onto the Ukrainian road network and use that to their advantage. If you look at the Ukrainian advances over the last few days, they have been all up and down those main roads north of Kyiv, and then in the eastern part of the country. So the big armored vehicles, big tanks, they've got to stay on those roads to keep moving and to get the supplies that they need. The fascinating thing is, I think, as we've noticed, the Ukrainians are doing very well in the north. They seem to be holding the Russians back. I think they are not doing as well on the defense in the south. If you notice, the Russian forces coming up from the Crimea have made it much farther north than the northern forces have made it south. And especially in the middle of the country, if they get on one of the main highways, they may be able to link up with the northern forces and cut the country in half. The big question, and this is sort of what I'll finish up on, is what are the responses to this? And I think both Ron and Cynthia highlighted some of them. I would highlight a couple of things to add in there. The conventional response of the Ukrainians has been relatively effective. The economic response that the international community has mounted has been surprisingly unified. But then finally, we don't know what's happening behind Russian lines. That is there an insurgency breaking out where ordinary Ukrainian special forces, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan against the United States, try to break up Russian forces in a much more irregular fashion? than we might expect. With that, I'll hand it back to you, John. Thanks for giving me the opportunity, and appreciate the audience.
Thanks, David. That's very comprehensive and informative. And it makes me, your reference to Afghanistan makes me think that a good book and movie recommendation for everybody is Charlie Wilson's War, about the U.S. getting arms to Afghan rebels.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, Tatiana, I wonder, can you sort of expand on, elaborate on what impact this crisis is having for migration and refugees in Europe?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Tatiana. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Brick School. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the devastating impacts, particularly in terms of loss of life, that have resulted from this violent military attack. We gather this afternoon to talk about an ever-evolving situation. And so I hope that I can share some insights to help us better understand how this Ukrainian refugee crisis is ongoing. First and foremost, I want to offer a key definition to what is the difference between asylees and refugees. Now, I will use this term interchangeably, but there are some legal differences. Particularly, a refugee is someone granted status while they're outside the country that they're attempting to gain status in. And asylees are those that are in the country or at the border. So we're really talking about an asylees, but we use this term interchangeably, and I just wanted to start with that. So let's jump right in. As of March 3rd, so as of yesterday, what we know about these immigration flows. What we know is that within the first few days, there was about 500,000 migrants fleeing from Ukraine to neighboring countries. And within just 7 days, that number reached 1 million. Now, predictions estimate that an additional 4 million people will be fleeing Ukraine within the coming weeks. To contextualize how big 1 million people, what that represents, we're talking about the entire state population of Rhode Island or the entire state population of Montana. And if we reach this 5 million estimates, Ukraine refugee population will become the second largest refugee population, second only to the Syrian population, which is at 6.7 million currently. So this is a very large migration. Now, what do we know exactly about this population? In reality, we know very, very little, but from my research, what I gathered is that Ukraine's president declared a state of emergency that quickly changed on the February 24th. I'm so sorry for the sirens. That quickly changed on February 24th when martial law was enacted. Okay. And with the enactment or invocation of martial law, the president actually temporarily restricted all men aged 18 to 60 from leaving Ukraine. So what does this tell me? It means that the current refugee influx is women and children. There have been reports that unaccompanied and separated children are arriving at the border. And the third component of this migration flow would be third country nationals. So we're thinking individuals of other countries that were currently in Ukraine. And we are also thinking, for example, Ukraine hosts refugees and asylees too as a nation. They actually host about 5,000 of them. And these folks represent over 60 countries. Now, in regards of where is this population fleeing to? The top 5 receiving countries are Poland, Hungary, the Republic of Moldova, Slovakia, and Romania. However, the vast majority are arriving in Poland. So of these top 5 receiving countries, 87% of the flow is arriving to them, and Poland receives 52% of the flow, which means, to contextualize, that in the last 7 days, Poland has received 500,000 refugees at their border. Now, I want to know, and something we can talk in discussion, is that actually the 6th top receiving country is Russia. And I can talk a little bit about certain actions that Russia took prior to these events that might have made this possible. So let me give you a very brief overlook at the international response. Generally, especially from Ukraine's neighbors, the response has been an outpour of public and political support for refugees. Political leaders have enacted basic border preparedness. So they're bringing volunteers, food sources, water, medicines to the border. They've also publicly announced ease of documentation requirements. So lifting of visa requirements, allowing individuals to arrive at the border and be processed without documentation such as passports, which we would generally require. And let me switch then to what we're now needing to think about in terms of long-term refugee resettlement. So I'm not going to get into this list, but I just want to give you a flavor of how complicated, interwoven, and difficult thinking about refugee resettlement is going to be in this area of the world. And that's because there's so many layers of law that governs these immigration flows. So we start from international law with the basic Geneva Convention in 1951, all the way down to the European-Ukraine Agreement that happened and went into full force in 2017. Now we also add that complexity that the Ukraine is not an EU member, it's not a Schengen member, and it's not a NATO member, but 80% of these immigrants are arriving in countries that are either Schengen, NATO, or EU, and if not all of those categories. So it adds an extreme complexity. Now, to end, I really want to talk about what the US can do. So in the short term, we can expand temporary protected status. This is already a legal immigration status that's available, which basically offers legal status to anyone from a country that we designate as having difficulty or being unsafe. This would particularly help Ukrainians currently in the US that are potentially facing an expiring visa or are here on a tourist visa, and would allow them to remain in the US for a certain amount of time. We could also drop the visa entry requirement. So Ukraine, because it's not a member of the EU, anyone traveling to the US from this country would need a B1 or B2 visa. We can temporarily lift that. And then thinking long-term, it is imperative that the United States is bolstering its refugee resettlement process. This is a process that saw quite a broad dwindling of resources during the Trump era, and that has began to see a shift under the Biden administration, but much of the work still remains to be done. As I foreshadowed, and I hope I can continue to foreshadow, cooperation on the international stage for refugee resettlement is absolutely necessary. This is of utmost importance, especially for the United States, is not in immediate proximity. And then lastly, I would actually advocate that the US needs to consider creating a new visa type for this migration flow. And I can talk more about the Q&A, why I think that the refugee current status that's available is not appropriate for the current crisis that we're facing. Now I want to leave us on one last note, which is to think very critically about how political rhetoric really defines who in our immigration system is defined as needy, who is defined as vulnerable, and who we believe is eligible for relief. Highlighting that within the last 10 years, we've seen two refugee crises, one in the EU from Syria and one at the southern border of the United States, and that the response has been drastically different. And I want to highlight this moment in time as a potential example on how United Nations can come together to really support a vulnerable population, which we're seeing today. Thank you very much for your time, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Tatiana, for both describing this staggering scope of the problem and then for giving very specific approaches for starting to address it. So attendees, please feel free to type in questions into the Q&A. We will see them, although the rest of the attendees won't. And so to start off the questions, here's one for Cynthia. So it's estimated that over 5,000 Russians have been detained protesting this war. What role could the Russian anti-war protests play in this crisis?
Well, they could be quite significant. We know if you go back in history that there were anti-war protests as part of the milieu when the Tsarist regime was overthrown. This is more David's area, but when the Tsarist regime was overthrown during World War I. And now there were clearly a number of things at work, but we also have a lot of evidence that Putin is very fearful of his own citizens. And we think back to 2011, and there were tremendous protests in Moscow over his, quote, re-election. So the idea that protests are something that could burgeon beyond simply being based on the anti-war aspects has real potential. The other thing I would just mention is that when the Soviets failed in Afghanistan in the late 1980s, part of the reason, by all indications, that they pulled out was because of the discontent at home. So Anti-war protests have a potential. The one caution I would ask all of us to remember is that Putin is doing everything he can, and he currently seems to be fairly effective at limiting people's ability to get out and do that protest in a manner that can continue to grow. And I would just say he shuts down every alternate news network possible, anyone allegedly tied to protests. But I really give, not only do I give the Ukrainian people incredible credit for their chutzpah, but I also give those Russian protesters an incredible amount of respect for what they are willing to do in the face of a brutal dictator.
Mhm.
Over.
It's a great point. Thank you, Cynthia. Next question is for Ron. So Tatiana had pointed out that 1 million people have been displaced as a result of this conflict. Have the US and NATO been too timid in trying to mitigate the war?
I think they have. I think this is a crisis that has been in the making, if not for several months and several years. And, David so adroitly touched on the historical aspect of this, of Ukraine being the crown jewel. And the Russian Federation has always wanted this back as part of their crown. And the United States, in my humble opinion, should have pre-positioned Javelin missiles, should have pre-positioned weaponry, clothing for the Ukrainian people, so that when and if a crisis erupted, that those supplies would be there, as opposed to now a commitment or now a discussion of sending aid, as opposed to the aid already being there. But 1 million people, as Tatiana so eloquently talked about, think of the size and the scope and the numbers of people that you're making reference to, of that as a humanitarian crisis, and one that I think the United States and NATO have been very slow to not only act upon, but are now playing catch up, John, in this situation. And it remains to be seen of how many more people are going to come across those borders in the days to come. Millions, I think, as Tatiana pointed out.
Thank you. So question for David. Is this really different than all the invasions of other countries that the US has done over the years? So for example, of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable question for us to think about, I think, because one of the things about our own history, about the US's own history, is that we have frequently invaded sovereign countries because they're doing things that we don't like. We think the most obvious examples are Iraq. I would probably leave Afghanistan off because we were chasing bin Laden, but certainly I think the entire Western Hemisphere may have chuckled slightly when we were talking about how awful it is to depose democratically elected governments, because the United States has spent most of the 20th century doing exactly that to Latin and Central America, South and Central American countries. The difference I would really highlight, however, is that at least recently, the US has been much better about not going after democratic nations. That is, Iraq was a dictatorship. Somalia was a failed state. And so while we still have a tendency to intervene very strongly, it's much less about overthrowing democratically elected governments that we don't like than it used to be. I do want to highlight, though, is that one of the things about this whole issue is that it illustrates how contextual and sort of thin international law actually is, in the sense that a lot of the international law that people have been invoking has either been not really applicable to what we're seeing. It is perfectly legal to attack civilians under international law as long as we have a military target in mind. And also how many of the precedents in international law for invading countries have actually been set by us. Putin was using words about genocide and about humanitarian catastrophes in Eastern Ukraine that echoed very much what we were talking about in places like Somalia and Iraq.
Thank you. A question for Tatiana. So as you alluded to, refugee resettlement has historically been a very contentious topic across the EU and the US. And so how is this situation different from, for example, like the Syrian refugee crisis?
Yeah, John, excellent. I mean, I would begin by saying that the response has been drastically different. And I would say we're in a few reasons why, but the main one that I can come up with is that the current international feeling toward this invasion is that there's a clear opponent and a clear morally right victim, to for lack of a better word, which is Ukraine. And so this mobilizes the international response to be much more unified in a clear directive, right? This was just not the case for the refugee crisis that we saw on our southern border or Syria. The objective, the bad person we were fighting against just wasn't as clear. It wasn't a person, it wasn't a name, it wasn't a clear instance. And so I think in this moment in history, while those characteristics of this invasion are so clear, we can learn from these examples and how the international community has responded to better respond when these characteristics are not so clear, right? So for example, in our southern border, there were immigrants from, or asylees or refugees from many different countries. The issues at home were of varying degrees. There wasn't this unified sense or rhetoric. And so that's what I allude to with the politicization of not only immigration law, but also why we're protecting, or why we are called to protect refugees, asylees, immigrants, etc.
Great, thank you. Cynthia, there's a couple of sort of very specific questions about what we're seeing sort of happening tactically. So for example, why isn't there more airborne activity? Why haven't the Ukrainians been able to destroy the stationary multi-mile long convoy? Are there any aspects of this that you find particularly surprising, Cynthia?
Don't. I think that, again, the Ukrainians, while we're seeing an incredibly strong effort on their part, they are a considerably smaller force, and they too have challenges, even though they are fighting on their own turf. And I think that is part of the reason they've been unable to destroy the Russians in the way that we might anticipate, because they appear to be sitting ducks. One of the other hypotheses that I've heard is that the Russians feel safe that no one will take them on. This goes back to the question that Ron didn't get, at least if you did, I missed it, Ron, I apologize. I'm having to use my phone because I can't use Zoom on a US government computer. And I'm at the office. But, this whole question of why we don't have a no-fly zone goes back to this concern about Russia being a nuclear state and the possibility of two nuclear states going at each other. Yep. That is a line that NATO and the US seem to have decided that they will not cross, at least until this point. It is something that could change. I have heard arguments saying when this continues to drag out, what we would be better off to see is for NATO to abandon that position. But Ukraine is not a member of NATO. I will say one thing that I think it was David said that is an interesting point, and I alluded to it in my remarks, is Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons as a result of guarantees that we made in the mid-1990s. So the Ukrainian answer on international law and on legal commitments is, but you made a commitment to us as well. And it does lead to a question as to how persuasive we will be with other states who we are trying to get to denuclearize in the future. There are particular circumstances in this case, but one of the curious things about history is it turns out to be something people use when it suits their purpose, if they can cite something. And so I think that we see a whole series of tactical questions that I think are driven by this fear that we don't want to see this escalate. Yet what is interesting about that
is there does seem to be massive support in most of the world for these actions. And therefore, one can see where the governments involved could indeed decide, based on the will of their own populations, that aggressive direct role in helping the Ukrainians. I don't see it right now, but it's certainly a possibility. Over.
John, could I jump in quickly on something Cynthia said? I want to emphasize for the audience that a no-fly zone is not just something that you announce and it happens. A no-fly zone is a major military operation. We declare a no-fly zone. That means we have to start shooting down Russian planes that violate it. It means we have to start attacking Russian surface-to-air sites that would otherwise shoot our planes down over the Ukraine. It means a full-scale shooting war. So it's not you don't just declare a no-fly zone. You have to win air supremacy first by killing an awful lot of Russians, and then potentially no-fly zone is. And that's what everybody's trying to avoid, is we don't want to get in a shooting war with Russia, and a no-fly zone would be exactly that. The second thing, and I'll be quick, is one of the worrying things about nuclear weapons is that deterrence is based on the idea that of both sides that they don't want to die. That if we nuke somebody, they're going to nuke us back, and everybody's going to die. Mm-hmm. And that's great for nation states. But what happens with authoritarian regimes is when the dictator starts to worry that he or she is going to die or lose power, it becomes less important to them about whether they take the whole country with them or not. So there's this moment, if Putin thinks he's going to get shot in the back of the head by one of his own generals, but before he loses command authority over the nuclear weapons, deterrence no longer works. And that's kind of a scary situation to be in when it's down to sort of what Vladimir Putin thinks his health prospects over the next 24 hours are.
Could I just add very quickly, that's what my bullet on the second slide referred to towards the end. And let me be explicit. If it were the case that Putin, who is so aware of how the Soviet Union ended between 1989 and late 1991, were to worry that he would be the one hanging from the gallows in the central square in Moscow instead of the Ceausescu's in Romania, that's the scenario that we worry will motivate him. And the fact that he has made multiple references to nuclear weapons doesn't mean he will use them, but means he's acutely sensitive to the power that threat implies. Over.
So I'll raise for the whole group a question that's kind of come up in different forms. Is Putin rational?
It's interesting, John. Let me take that. Watching Dr. Condoleezza Rice on one of the news shows last Sunday, that she mentioned that the Vladimir Putin that she met, that she worked with, that President Bush met and worked with, is not the same person today. And I think it goes to what Cynthia and David have touched on, is that you get the impression that he feels that he's backed in a corner. He recognizes that protests against him could potentially lead to him being deposed from office, and he doesn't want to leave office. So the question that I would sort of throw back to you is he rational? I think he's rational in the sense that he is making great use of rhetoric, making great use of trying to evoke pride in Russia. But the question becomes, is that a rational reason for him to go to war and to kill thousands of civilians, which I think none of us would agree that's the case. But I think in his mind, he thinks that it is a rational action to keep him in power and keep him in a position of influence for years to come.
Another way to put that, Ron, is to ask the question, what is his ultimate objective? And I don't think any of us are entirely certain of that. Is it to eradicate Ukraine? Is it to stay in power? We are assuming that, but With Putin, we don't know, he is a different person. And so part of the problem in a non-transparent system, which authoritarian systems are, and especially Russia today, is we simply are speculating as to what he wants and how far he would go to achieve that. I think we're all pretty confident that he doesn't want to be overthrown. But again, that's actually a pretty vague statement.
Thank you. So a question for Tatiana. An interesting question came over about the role of the media in this conflict. What are your thoughts on the role of the media in generating sympathy and support for addressing the refugee problem, for the Ukrainian people, for just awareness of the conflict?
Yeah, it goes in hand with your previous question of whether it's Putin rational, and I was going to add that much of the rhetoric that he rationalized for Russia was the need and the humanitarian calling to help Russians in Ukraine that were being forced to learn Russian and not speak, or sorry, Ukrainian, not speak their language, not be able to freely express their Russian roots. So in answering of that previous question, yeah, there has been very rational use and proliferation of messaging, right? And secondly, I mean, in the context of Russia, where the media is extremely controlled, it's very easy for Putin and to paint a picture of what that humanitarian crisis needed and how the response was that he is leveraging is appropriate. Now, in terms of the flip side, the Ukrainian side, how has media, I mean, media today, it's difficult. Like I said, we know very little, and what we do know is because of reports and media and social media. Right now on the borders, the efforts have not necessarily been to be documenting and counting and collecting demographic information. It's been like, how can we get folks across the border, right? Like there's a much more urgent need, which is, it's fair. So media accounts will be very valuable as this situation unfolds. And I think it's helped gain, as I mentioned, this international invokement of like support and solidarity, and one that, as I mentioned, politically and by law, we really need like a congruent stance. So in that sense, I do think it can help maybe facilitate political will, invoke and amplify like citizens support for aid and action. Yeah, that's how I see media kind of taking shape in terms of refugee resettlement.
To build off of that, I agree with everything Tatiana just said. One of the fascinating things and something that surprised me was how good the Ukrainians have been at getting out exactly the kind of heartwarming is a little strong, but sort of affecting stories, whether it's the border, the people on Shark Island who told a Russian warship to do something problematic, to the Ukrainian farmer who apparently stole an ATV, an armored vehicle with his tractor. The Ukrainians have been really good at this kind of information warfare, at getting their message out, and that was a big shock to me.
Or what we would say in strategy terms is they have used the information instrument across the board very effectively.
Yep.
Interesting.
And I would also remind the folks who are watching us that President Zelensky was a former comedian, a former actor. He knows very well how to effectively hit the airwaves to motivate his population and his people. And I think he's done a remarkable job of that.
Yeah,
absolutely. So before we go to just closing statements, one final question concerns NATO, right? So it's been sort of alleged that NATO's post-Cold War expansion may have led to this conflict. Do you think there's any truth to that claim? And what are the implications of this conflict for whether and how NATO should expand in the future? I don't know if David, if you want to start us off on that.
Sure. I think the simple answer is yes. I mean, in the sense that I wouldn't say that it was the only cause of it, but NATO expansion confirmed Putin in his worldview. Russia had come apart they were losing power, and here their sort of traditional enemies are sort of creeping closer. Before the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no NATO country that actually bordered with the Soviet Union, and now there are several that border with Russia. And so I think that it's absolutely the case that it helped, was one of the causes of the conflict. That doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility or make it the West's fault. But it is, I think, one of the causes. But it also reminds us of one of the dangers of making commitments to countries or groups in places where it becomes very difficult to then back that commitment up. And Cynthia mentioned the denuclearization of Ukraine as a good example. I would also point to Taiwan as a place where it's a very awkward commitment for us to have to live up to. And if Putin ends up invading the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, which are now NATO members, it's going to be really difficult for us to wage a war that far away from the United States.
I would raise another issue that Putin seems to be very taken with, and it's again got a parallel with China, and that is that he appears to believe that the Russian civilization, and certainly Russia itself, was humiliated with NATO expansion. Mm-hmm. And I personally believe that the role of humiliation in the psyche of authoritarian regimes, something they may be using as a tool, but it's something that goes to the insecurities of the regime. And it's something that I think has been simmering in him. And that's what we first saw at the Munich speech about 15 years ago, when he recognized that what he thought was a violation of Iraq's sovereignty was something that could be used elsewhere. It reignited concerns about NATO potentially violating and humiliating Russia. And that's a lot of potentially psychobabble on my part, but I really think that seems to be something that he comes back to fairly often, especially in these couple of really weird speeches that he's given in the last month.
Interesting. So with 5 minutes left, it'd be great to just have 1 minute closing statements from each of the panelists. Your sense of where things are going, or important considerations for policymakers. Ron, do you want to get us started?
Thanks, John. I think the United States is in a very difficult situation. You heard David sort of touch on this a few moments ago, but our military philosophy has always been able to have the ability to wage war in two different theaters. And I think what we're looking at right now is, can we, if we have to go to defense of the Baltic states or other states in Europe, wage war there and also hold off the threat of China invading Taiwan? I don't have the answer to that. I think the United States is engaged in a very difficult diplomatic dance. They don't want to provoke the bear, as I said from the outset, of a fellow military power who has nuclear weapons. So those are the considerations that we have to keep in mind. But looking back to what Tatiana said, we also are at the outset of a major humanitarian crisis. So between humanitarian crisis, military conflict, and diplomacy, the United States and our fellow allies are in a pickle, I think, for the next several months as to how we can unwind this very difficult situation.
Thank you. Tatiana?
I would echo and say that irrelevant of what we do in terms of diplomacy and military action, the U.S. is not prepared for this humanitarian crisis and this refugee flow that we are bound to experience some flow. And discussions of how our immigration system needs to act now to get those processes solidified needed to happen a long time ago, but needs to happen urgently.
Thank you. Cynthia?
I would like to make 2 points that may sound unrelated, but they have the potential to be related. One is that we have a tendency when we look at something like this to focus on the particular moment we're in, which makes all the sense in the world. But the example I would give was, if we had this conversation last Friday, everybody was pretty upbeat that maybe this was going to turn things around because Ukraine had actually made it through 24 hours and maybe the Russians would get the hint and go home. We are very bad at judging time when it comes, I would argue, to conflict. But that takes me to the second point, and it goes to something Ron mentioned and that David has also mentioned. And that is a provocative question I would leave everybody with. And that is, do we in the United States want, not do we have the capability, but do we want to make an open-ended commitment to a state like Ukraine or Taiwan into the foreseeable future? I am not judging that. As David knows, I spend lots of my time in life looking at China, and I am no fan of China whatsoever, and I spend a lot of time on Taiwan. But these are two states that, because of geography, which is never going to change in our natural lifetime, would de facto require us to put them into protectorate status in order to guarantee their survival in their current conditions. I'm not sure that we've thought about that. And it's just something we probably need to discuss in our public policy debates.
Thank you. And David.
Yeah, I'm gonna go Cynthia one better and have 3 points. Sorry. But my first point actually picks up on what she was talking about, which is the United States has a very strong overestimation of how much influence we have in certain areas of the world. And this is one of them. We are at the very limits of being able to influence what's going on. And so one of the discussions we have to think about is that this is like Taiwan, and like Cynthia said, this is a place where it's very difficult for us to do much more than we're doing. And any further step comes with all sorts of really serious consequences. The second thing, and this is, I think, more ground level, is that Russia's winning the war at the moment. Russia's winning slowly and with a lot of casualties, but that's the way they're fighting. They're probably going to encircle Kyiv pretty soon. They're moving pretty quickly up from the south. Russia's winning the war. And that's something that we need to acknowledge and be aware of. But the final point, as we discovered and as Russia discovered in Afghanistan and us in Iraq, winning a war is not the same thing as keeping that victory. If the Russians occupy Ukraine, I'm guessing it's going to look a lot more like Afghanistan did than anything else. So Putin may conquer the Ukraine, but keeping it conquered is a lot more of a difficult task than he might have thought of. Great,
thank you. So thank you to all the panelists, Ron Christie, David Silby, Cynthia Watson, and Tatiana Padilla. Thank you to everyone who's attended. It's been a very thoughtful and enlightening discussion, and we'll have the recording of this up on the Brooks School of Public Policy website very soon. So thanks very much and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.